The Illinois General Assembly passed a maintenance-level $40 billion state budget Saturday night and early Sunday that would rely heavily on federal funding to close a gaping pandemic-driven deficit.
The spending plan for the budget year that begins July 1 is headed to Gov. J.B. Pritzker's desk after a party line vote in the Senate just before 1 a.m. Sunday.
Later Sunday morning, Pritzker touted the budget lawmakers passed for what it does to support services most heavily affected by COVID-19, and responded to Republican criticisms that the Democratic-controlled legislature gave him too much latitude in managing the budget and its reliance on uncertain federal dollars.
We're relying on them to do the right thing for Republican-led states and Democratic states, Pritzker said of the federal government, in a Sunday morning news conference in Springfield. This isn't something special for Illinois, it really is a problem that every state is experiencing. And so I hope that Republicans will step up here instead of simply complaining about the need that the state has to do what I've been doing, to get dollars from the federal government to support our state.
State agencies that have been most affected by the pandemic, such as those dealing with public health and welfare, would see funding increases under the spending plan.
The Senate voted 37-19 to adopt the spending plan for the coming year, with all Republican opposing the budget.
We made a choice not to present a budget to this chamber that slashes the state budget at a time when we're dealing with a global pandemic, said Democratic Senator Andy Manar of Bunker Hill, a lead budget negotiator. That was our choice. That was a simple choice for me because the last thing we need to be doing is cutting public health programs, cutting health care programs, cutting school funding, cutting programs for small businesses, or cutting pensions or laying off state employees.
But Republicans objected to a small increase in state spending at a time full of fiscal uncertainty.
Senator Dale Ryder of Mattoon said he appreciated that the budget doesn't count on any revenue from the graduated rate income tax that voters must approve through a constitutional amendment in November, but noted outstanding questions about what other revenues will look like in the coming months and how much help Washington will provide.
We are grateful for that. We think it's a better product for that, Ryder said. But it is still an enormous gamble as we stand here on May 23.
On Saturday, House Majority Leader Greg Harris, a Chicago Democrat, characterized the budget plan as representative of a series of tough choices that resulted in a combination of working with the Federal Reserve and setting ourselves on a path to a slow, sustainable return to some fiscal normalcy.
Our state has been ravaged by the pandemic, just like our nation, Harris said. People are struggling, families are struggling, local governments are struggling, our schools are struggling. And yes, we as the state are struggling too.
The House voted largely along party lines to advance the budget, 68-44.
The budget plan would allow for borrowing of up to $5 billion from the Federal Reserve that would be repaid with expected but uncertain federal aid from Washington. State officials also hope there will be a loosening of restrictions on how the state can spend $3.5 billion in federal aid the state has already received.
Deputy House Republican leader Tom Demmer called the budget balanced on a wing and a prayer, and took issue with a proposal to give Pritzker additional leeway to manage the budget amid the continuing public health crisis, which he called giving a longer leash to an executive branch that has not earned it.
The budget would not provide school districts with the $350 million increase in state aid that was set out in a 2018 rewrite of the education funding formula. Districts would instead receive the same amount they received this year. Universities also would be funded at their current levels.
Do we really believe that allocating this unprecedented level of control to the executive branch is the only way or the best way that we can serve our constituents during this public health emergency? Demmer said, I suggest the opposite is the preferred path.
Republicans have been critical of Pritzker's actions in response to the pandemic as overreach, and have asserted that the legislature should be more heavily involved in those decisions. Pritzker on Sunday continued to defend his actions, saying they were necessary to respond to the public health emergency.
This talk about earning the authority, nobody knew a pandemic was coming, Pritzker said in a Sunday morning news conference in Springfield. There's just no way that anybody had any clue that we would be in this situation that we're in right now.
He added, the legislature has chosen not to be involved in many of the decisions that needed to be made by the executive branch. And I think, when you think about it, that's why you have an executive branch. In an emergency, I can act quickly, the executive branch can act quickly.
Opposition to Pritzker's executive actions intensified when his administration filed an emergency rule earlier this month that would have subjected businesses that defy his reopening plan to a misdemeanor charge. Pritzker withdrew that rule last week, and said lawmakers would work on legislation to create an enforcement mechanism during the special session.
That didn't happen before adjournment early Sunday morning, which Pritzker called a complete abdication of responsibility.
The Illinois State Police asked for the rule as a way to issue a citation for businesses that don't comply with Pritzker's order, rather than make an arrest, he said.
Under state law, a Class A misdemeanor is punishable by up to $2,500 and 364 days in jail.
When we left it to the legislature to decide what that citation would be, I was hopeful and expectant that they would deliver to me a bill that said that Pritzker said Sunday. But they were unwilling to vote on anything like that, or they didn't get it done, and so we're going to have to look at other mechanisms. But the fact is, I think the legislature failed in this regard.
J. Monks at ChicagoTribune.com.
D. Petrella at ChicagoTribune.com.